Hello. Scotch whiskey is considered by many to be the original whiskey, the gentleman's tipple. Well, it wasn't the first, but its traditions have indeed stood the test of time, although it has reinvented itself a few times due to market pressures, and indeed is now seen as cool enough for hipsters of every gender. We'll look at the pinnacle of this category, the single malt, but also explore what most people actually drink, which are the blends with mostly grain whiskeys by volume. We'll discuss them side by side to hopefully better show the similarities and differences by direct contrast. Let's go. First, some legal definitions. We'll cover additional legal requirements as we go through the relevant whiskey production processes. But to start, Scotch whiskey of any type must be mashed, fermented, distilled, matured, and bottled in Scotland. Note we start at the mash. The raw material does not have to come from Scotland. All Scotch whiskey must be one of 5 types. We have our single malt Scotch whiskey. Single means one distillery. The malt means 100% malted barley. Scotch means that the mashed through bottled happened in Scotland. Our single grain whiskey is from a single distillery and made from malted barley and other grains. Although there is way more grain whiskey made in Scotland than malt whiskey, you rarely see a bottling of single grain whiskey. Also somewhat rare are our blended malt whiskeys, which instead of a single distillery are multiple distilleries, but malt meaning 100% malted barley. Similarly, the blended grain category, which is barley, malt, and other grains from multiple distilleries. The last category, and the hugely dominant one with regard to volume, is blended Scotch whiskey. This is at least one single malt Scotch whiskey and at least one single grain whiskey. This is where all that grain whiskey goes to. Blended with single malts into blended Scotch whiskey, like Diageo's Johnnie Walker, J&B, Black and White, and Pernod Ricard's Chivas, and Ballantine's and Bacardi's Dewar's, which gets you to 3/4 of the total Scotch market just with those guys. But more on that later. Besides being made in Scotland, another legal requirement is the use of endogenous enzymes for hydrolysis. If I lost you there, head over to the relevant lectures and then come back. So, even in the case of grain whiskey, the only enzymes we can add or use are through malted barley or malt. Now, the industry is of a scale now where local barley production cannot meet the demand, so barley is imported from the Baltics and Eastern Europe. Barley has enough of a shelf life in both dried and malted form to allow distilleries to produce year-round. Malting is occasionally done on site, but is usually done by third parties. The exception is often when peat is used. The signature cupola or pagoda atop distilleries are designed to house chimneys for the malting fires. Peat is actually used in a minority of Scotch whiskies, despite the stereotypes, and faces increasing environmental pressure to restrict or eliminate its use in Scotland. Peat bogs as habitat and peat's carbon capturing nature, combined with how dirty it is as a fuel, are all considerations. There is no known alternative to imparting those phenolics onto barley. But with whiskey production actually being a minor use of peat, like 1%, there is hope some use can be maintained. It was commonly used in Ireland 100-ish odd years ago until the Irish style was developed by the marketing big boys to contrast against the neighboring Scottish style. So back to our milling and mashing. Mashing must take place in Scotland with the ever-present spoilage concerns of our sugary wort. We are going to be moving quickly to get fermentation underway, and often we'll still have some conversion happening in the fermentation tanks. At this point, we have some opportunity for character development. Now with our non-barley grains, usually corn or wheat, not often both as the milling equipment is different for each, we'll do our mashing at the respective gelatinization temperature as outlined in the hydrolysis lecture. And our malt here is really only used for its enzymatic powers. We aren't generally looking for flavor here, but rather efficiency. Haters, go to the comments, please. Remember, the single in single grain refers to a single distillery, not a single grain type. So you could use corn and wheat or whatever. We go to fermentation with a cultured yeast and aim for a controlled, expeditious ferment within about 48 hours. Now over on our malt whiskey side, things may or may not be different. Some producers, as in most, are not too interested in flavors from the different colored or varieties of malts. Mashing or making the wort is fairly consistent. However, in fermentation, in what they call the mash tuns, we do see producers working on flavor development. You'll see shiny stainless steel mash tuns and then dirty open top wood ones being used. You'll see cultured or ambient yeast, short ferments or long ferments, and even sometimes a post-fermentation resting period designed to allow lactic acid bacterial formation and other microbial activity prior to distillation. So, with a 100% barley wash, we can see all sorts of different esterification, fatty acids, and fusel alcohols being developed as part of a signature style. Now we're off to distillation, where we have a legal separation in production techniques between our grain and malt whiskey. First, the easy one. Grain whiskey has no still requirement, and most are done to high rectification in column stills. All we have to do is stay under 94.8 ABV, which is not very hard, and while it's not 95, 96 like vodka, it's pretty neutral. Despite the volumes made and the high ABV, trade secrets abound and a lot of specifics aren't really made public. Apparently, we do see some vacuum stills being deployed. Now, don't think I'm trashing these grain spirits. They do need to be made with care to ensure consistency and still possess some subtle attractive character rather than off-putting notes. But the application of these is partly to provide a canvas for single malt character to be added, and maybe not at its potentially intense character that single malts may have, or as a delivery vehicle that adds some light, very light cereal notes that can make some contribution to a more clean, drinkable style. Our malt whiskey must be distilled in pot stills. Copper isn't mandated, but it's traditional, and some sulfur mitigation we talked about in prior lectures is expected. Double pot distillation is very common, but producers, especially smaller ones, play with 3 times and all sorts of blending and 2 and 3 time distill. Unlike, say, cognac, these pots can be any size and shape. The first still or the wash stills are usually larger with less concerns for reflux. Cuts are saved for the second distillation. The first pot gets us to our low wines at about 25% ABV. The spent material from the wash still is called pot ale. Then we mix the previous batch's heads and tails into the low wines and let it sit often to let our group 3 fusel alcohols or oils to separate and float to the top. As discussed in the distillation lecture, we can pull from the bottom to leave as many of those behind as we want. Our second distillation has a head, heart, and tails cut, with the heart averaging out at about 70% ABV before we move on to maturation. The heads and hearts again are heading back to the next batch. While there is experimentation, much of the production in Scotland is honed to consistency and efficiency. Most single malts are destined for use as blending agents for those established big blend brands who aren't interested in changes to their blending components until they ask for it. And even then, they will make changes more at the blending stage rather than here at the distillation stage. This has been the case for many decades, although the rise of single malt popularity and the consumers being willing to try new and artisan-feeling products has allowed for more experimentation in the single malts category. While we discuss pot stills in the pot still lecture, there are a couple of adaptations common in our Scottish pot distillations. Heat source is not mandated, and most have steam coils inside the pot or an external heat exchanger. A few still do direct heat, like Glenfiddich and Glenfarclas, and use a mechanical whisking stirrer called a rummager to minimize hot spots and burning. Basically a way to reduce those Maillard reactions. And then up on the line arm before the main condenser, which is usually a shell and tube, but sometimes a worm tub, there is a head condenser deflag pipe device called a purifier that a few will use. These are like a tiny worm tub with coolant running through, and the tube goes through the liquid, and a bit of the least volatile compounds, think some group 3s, get condensed and are sent back into the pot. As expected, we'll get a lighter, cleaner spirit when a purifier is in action. The shell and tube, with its higher copper contact, will also lighten a spirit compared to a worm tub. Again, lighter is a style choice and shouldn't carry a quality inference. As expected, our choices in cuts brings style and character implications. Lighter styles can be encouraged by a later cut to hearts and earlier cut to tails. Glenfiddich prides itself on this style. Later cuts to tails and less copper results in a meatier, more robust spirit. If we brought peat into the picture back at malting, we're going to want to stretch the heart into an otherwise tail cut, as much of that peaty character lives just right at the edge of standard group 2, beginning of group 3. Timing the cut here can determine how the peat shows itself, being a hint in the background or an even later cut brings it front and center. Freedom from still shape regulations means we can have short squat stills, tall elegant stills, some even stainless steel condensers. We also have line arm positioning and length that can add reflux. From what you know now, it shouldn't be hard to blind taste Glenfarclas versus Glenmorangie, even though neither is peated and both use shell and tube condensers. Glenmoe's steam-coiled, super tall, long horizontal line arm stills versus Glenfarclas' squat, direct heated, downward angled line arm stills. Now that we are off the stills, Scotch whisky law mandates 3 years of aging, in oak, in Scotland. The largest container size is a 700-liter cask. This is for both malt and grain whiskeys. American Standard Barrels, or ASBs, are the easiest to come by, but as they are broken down prior to shipping over to Scotland, they are often rebuilt into hogsheads or hoggies, which are actually 15 to 20% bigger than ASBs. While we do see the larger sherry butts used, these are more for finishing and higher end single malts, as they are more expensive and increasingly harder to come by. We really aren't looking to add maturation character to our grain whiskeys. The maturation process, along with blending, is very important to our Scottish distillers. The traditional single-storied dunnage warehouse with its dirt floors and barrels stacked only 3-4 high is still used, but volume in modern building materials has meant more efficient means of storage are often now in use. We first expanded into taller warehouses with floor-to-ceiling racking systems that we call racked warehouses. Imagine that. And then the just as creatively named palletized warehouses, where we stand 4 barrels on a pallet and then we can stack those 6 or more high. Now, accessing these barrels to check on them is not easy, but Scotland's typical cool, wet climate means they mature slow and somewhat consistently compared to a hot Kentucky rickhouse with its large temperature variations. Yes, in these large palletized warehouses, there can be a difference that the blender will be aware of. Less so in a dunnage warehouse. The humidity or water in the air means less water wants to leave the barrel, and many barrels lose ABV over time rather than gain it. The choice of an used ASB is not just an economical one. A dominant wood character imparted from new oak isn't an aromatic or flavor component desired by most Scotch whiskey producers. The slow oxidation is the primary use for these barrels, and this is far and away the most used barrel. By breaking the barrels down, they dry out, and any American whiskey character imparted is very subtle. Now, sherry butts and a bunch of other barrels from rum aging, Bordeaux, Sauterne barrels, port, Madeira barrels, Calvados casks, those are a different story. These are used to directly impart flavor, not wood flavor as much as what was in those barrels previously. These last ones are generally our finishing barrels, and the whiskey doesn't stay in them for years, but rather a few months maybe to pick up that character. With regard to sherry, all the way back to Sir Francis Drake's sacking of Cadiz and stealing a bunch of sherry, the UK has been a big market and even blender and shipper for sherry. Originally how sherry was transported, there was just a surplus of these barrels to be had, so they were a natural choice. These weren't dried out like the ASBs, but rather put right into use, and that sherry character, still lingering in the staves, was imparted into the whiskey and became a very desirable component. Once sherry started being bottled in Spain and stopped being shipped in butts, or some English royal messed with the wrong Spanish royal causing a trade war, as well as a global reduction in demand for sherry itself, these butts became more and more scarce. Nowadays, distillers have contracts directly with sherry producers in order to get access to these butts. The distillery will go as far as to mandate which sherries and for how long they are stored in the barrel before it's shipped over to the UK, with often a little sherry left swooshing around in there. The aged sherry styles of Amontillado and Oloroso are the most revered. They can add this dried fruit, marmalade, and orange peel, as are the sherries made from the dried raisin Pedro Ximenez. That's a grape, not a person. That raisin character is also often a little welcome addition. Dump a little bit out and quickly get the whiskey in, and there, voila. Now, if you don't have the Spanish contacts or the money to do it this way, there is a way around it that, well, not many like to talk about. If you get your hands on a cask that doesn't have this lovely sherry character, you can make it using Paxaret. You buy some sherry, boil it down to a dark, sweet syrup, and then spray it with a pressure washer onto the inside of your cask. Drain out any surplus, and then voila. Now, who does this and who doesn't isn't common knowledge, as it doesn't sound too sexy. But back to our whiskey approaching at least 3 years in our American standard barrels. We probably have a spreadsheet or database of how old our ASBs are and hoggies are. Usually they're used 2 to 4 times, and then where in the warehouse they were if applicable, and it's time to make a blend for bottling. Before this, we may have pulled some and moved it over to one of those finishing barrels. Our story diverges here depending on whether we are making a blended Scotch whiskey or a single malt whiskey. For most of history, the blended category dominated with those big names owning distribution and export channels. Most distilleries made their money by making a single malt whiskey that someone like Dewar's or Johnny Walker or Grant's used in a blend. They had just one customer to keep happy who demanded consistency through the years. But now take Johnny Walker-owned Mortlach that for the past 20 odd years has started releasing various single malts. To give an idea as to the diversity possible in a single malt, they have a lovely 16-year-old single malt, completely matured in sherry cask, calculated to have been distilled 2.81 times. They have 3 wash stills ranging from just over 7,000 liters to one over 17,000 liters, then 3 spirit stills from 8,000 to 9,000 liters. They make a standard double distilled new make from the big wash and spirit stills and send through their wooden worm tub condensers. Then they take the pot ale or waste from the wash still and add heads from other distillations and redistill. They also have a new make from their intermediate stills, all of which gets blended into the release. That's how they end up with a 2.81 times distilled product. And even our single malts are blended from stocks into marrying vessels upwards of 50,000 liters or 13,000 gallons before bottling. Our blended whiskeys don't have single in the name and are mostly by volume blends from other producers. These distillers will usually make some spirit, a single malt or 2 to look good at the visitor centers, or to also show that they can do it too. But given how much of the entire Scotch whiskey volume is grain spirits, it's curious that of the 120 odd distilleries active today, 7 are grain whiskey distilleries, and the rest are malt distilleries. This clearly shows the industrialization of that grain whiskey production, as these 7 make most of the whiskey in Scotland. The value of Scotch whiskey globally as the leading whiskey category has also meant consolidation, with Diageo owning a quarter of all the distilleries and having 100 different single malt and blended brands. Pernod Ricard owns 15 or so, and the global players like Beam Suntory and Bacardi all have ownership stakes of Scottish distilleries. So our blended whiskey takes a number of grain whiskeys and then blends a number of single malts into whatever recipe is needed. That grain component allows blends to be made much more affordable than single malts, which helps with market share. But the best blended whiskeys can still be extraordinary in quality, taking the best from the various components to craft something unique. These blends often come with aging and fetch prices above almost all single malts. Before we talk more about aging, we do need to mention that we are not allowed to sweeten the spirit, but we can chill filter and add caramel color. There is a trend away from both of these in the single malt world, but Kirkland's blended whiskey at just over 3 years of age didn't get that color from oak. This is a regular feature of blends and whiskeys without aging statements. The aging statements are by law the age of the youngest component in the blend, no matter how small a percentage, and not the average age. In addition to age, you may see one of the 5 official regions in Scotland. There is no part of Scotland that isn't in a region, with Highlands acting as a catch-all across the north and through most of the islands. Highland also encompasses Speyside, so Macallan, which is actually in Speyside, can call itself a Highland as it does, because it sounds more Scottish for sure. We also have Campbelltown, Lowland, and Islay. Although there are no mandated associated styles, those Islas are at least pretty much expected to have a peaty character. Very rarely you will see a vintage date, which means all the spirit was distilled in that year. Bottling date and age statements should be present here. But from what you know about whiskey production, vintage or distillation date compared to, say, fermentation protocol or maturation regimen can't really indicate that much about quality, but it looks cool on the label. You will also see the ABV, which has to be 40% ABV minimum. Hopefully this lecture provided you with a greater understanding and appreciation of what may be in your bottle of Scotch whiskey. Understanding the mashing, fermentation choices, distillation processes, maturation regimen should help demystify what's in that bottle. Slán.